G'day everybody, welcome back to the channel, continuing the video series previewing the upcoming Australian federal election, and today's focus is South Australia, which over the course of this century has undergone a significant shift from being very much a Liberal heartland sort of area in the Howard era, where the Liberals would win both the statewide two-party preferred count and the seat count, to now Labor having control of most of the seats, and the two-party preferred is very much trending in their direction, with the exception of some high watermark years like 2013. In addition to that, at the moment, the political environment in South Australia is such that the state Labor brand is very strong under Premier Malinauskas, whereas the state Liberals are dysfunctional and seen to be controlled by the arch-conservative factions, which is really killing some of their moderate appeal in metropolitan Adelaide. So we can see by the map what's been going on over the years. South Australia has lost 2 seats over the course of the last sort of 20 or 30 years, which has basically robbed the LNP of one of their seats, robbed Labor of one of their seats, but helped Labor with the margins in most of the others, making the Liberal-held seats, particularly Boothby and Sturt here, more marginal as time has gone on, whereas also making some of these Labor seats in sort of central and northern Adelaide, where they've really consolidated their vote, a little bit more safe for them. So what that's resulted in is a situation where the Liberals have a floor of 2 seats, the 2 sort of big rural seats of Grey and Barker, but their ceiling is really only 4. It's going to be really tough for them. They would need quite a big swing to gain anything more than 4 of the 11 seats currently up for grabs. Okay, so that's really it for the history of the state politically. So we'll move on to some key seats. There's only 2. So the first one is Boothby, which was formerly a safe LNP seat, particularly during the Howard years, but over the 2010s in particular, it became very marginal, and finally, for the first time since World War II, Labor were able to flip it in 2022. They currently hold it on a 3.3% margin, and this is interesting because the current national polling shows a swing to the Liberals nationwide of probably a little bit more than that, more like 4 or 5%. But as we'll see later, that doesn't quite pair with statewide South Australian federal voting intention. The only other thing to note here is that the former Liberal MP Nicole Flint is going to be recontesting, so if she has a personal vote of any significance, that could really influence the result with such a tight margin currently. It's one of those seats where if the coalition is going to form majority government and flip at least 20 seats, this is probably one of the ones they'll need to flip. The other seat of note that's competitive is Sturt. So this is here, number 21, the final Liberal seat, or Liberal-held seat in metropolitan Adelaide. It's a sort of mix of that newer kind of progressive younger crowd moving in with more affluent older money at different ends of the electorate, and that's made it somewhat fertile ground for a potential Climate 200 backed Teal independent challenger. They have announced that they'll be supporting a candidate in this electorate. It's going to create a really interesting dynamic because in the seats that Teals win, usually both Labor and the Greens run dead and allow their preferences to flow to the Teal and push them over the Liberal candidate in the final count. But as we've seen in state elections in Victoria and New South Wales, when Labor are also competitive in these seats and the Teal independent doesn't make the final count, it's usually an advantage to the Liberal Party. So we'll see if that plays out in Sturt. I believe there's a good chance it will, although we should note that in 2016, one of the Nick Xenophon candidates actually managed to get into the two-party preferred count here in Sturt, and that was when it was Christopher Pyne's seat. So There's that potential for this electorate to back an independent, but at the same time, the Labor brand is really strong in the state. But then the national mood is against Labor and more towards the Liberals. So quite a lot of things going on here. Be a really interesting seat to watch. But definitely one that the Liberal Party are going to have to hold if they're going to govern either in majority or even in minority. They really can't afford any losses. So that's the end of our sort of key marginals. But there are some other trends that we'll keep an eye on election night. So firstly in Spence, that's up here, number 19, safe Labor seat, but it's that outer suburban, working class, sort of impacted by the cost of living type district where Dutton's really made it his mission to connect with some of these voters. And they did vote no in big numbers in the Voice referendum last year. So it's not really a case of whether they can flip this seat, but whether or not they can make a big dent in Labor's margin and possibly put it on the map for 2028. Then in Adelaide, which is the seat around central Adelaide, again, this is another seat that the Liberals actually won a few times in the Howard years, but it's now quite safe for Labor. But over recent years, the Greens have begun to really make some inroads. Their primary vote is sitting at about 20%, so a big gap between them and Labor at 40%. But it will be interesting if it's one of those seats where over the years it sort of becomes a bit more like, say, McNamara in Victoria, and the Liberal primary is stuck sort of in the early 30s, and slowly the Greens and Labors come together, and at some point maybe the Greens will be able to overtake Labor and then win the seat on Labor preferences. Probably not this time. Probably not even next time, but it's one to watch for the future. And then Mayo, which is this seat in grey, number 26, currently held by Rebecca Sharkey, who was first elected under the Nick Xenophon banner, but now sits as a sort of quasi-independent. It was once Liberal heartland, and if you remove the independent from the count, it was still a Liberal seat up until last election, where it finally flipped to a notional Labor seat with no independent. So what I'm looking for is, can the Liberals get themselves back into the lead on that notional two-party preferred count? And then at some point, when Rebecca Sharkey retires, can the Liberals position themselves to actually win the seat back? Or will it be, really close marginal? So then, just a little note on some polling. Here I've got The Guardian's new sort of poll aggregate model. They're showing pretty much a status quo result for South Australia. If we go back here, we'll see it was 54-46 at the 2022 election, which is about 1.5% to the left of the rest of the nation. Whereas now, 46.3 to 53.7, so almost no change, even though that same aggregate is showing like a 4-point shift to the coalition nationally. And even Newspoll, who do a similar sort of aggregate of all their polls every quarter, their last update showed a very similar result for South Australia specifically. And then into the MRP polling, just to show what's happening at the more granular level potentially. So Boothby, none of these polls have the Liberals really denting the margin at all, and that's pretty much a status quo result for Labor if that holds up. In Sturt, they're showing it to be tightening. So at the moment, at the last count, it was actually too close to call. They had it as a toss-up on two-party preferred, but the two before that were Liberal retains. In Spence, not a huge deal of action, not really much movement, although we can see the ALP primary dipping just a little bit. They also have a high other vote, which a lot of that would be One Nation, who polled at about 12% in Spence last election. In Adelaide, we can see the Green vote actually deteriorating as the series goes on, so no danger to Labor there. Primary vote of 46%, that would be a big increase if that were to play out. And then finally in Mayo, one really good result for the Liberals there, 35% primary, but other than that, sort of stuck in the late 20s, early 30s. and then quite a low vote for the Greens and a firming vote for other, which would be Rebecca Sharkey. So it's going to be a safe independent retain, but no real clues as to what's going to happen between Liberal and Labor there. So finally, for my predictions at this point, in Sturt, I think the LNP will retain the seat. I suspect the national mood and the strength of the Labor Party at the state level will be enough to keep the Teal challenger from entering the final count, and the preference leakage that's likely to occur will favour the LNP and help them retain this seat on a margin of probably up to about 1%. In Boothby, I think it'll be a bit closer than what the MRP polls were saying, but I still think the LP will hold on there. In Spence, I think the Liberals will make good gains. I think One Nation will poll well, and their preferences will be a little bit more solidly flowing to the Liberals, and that will result in a much tighter margin. I'm expecting pretty much a status quo result on two-party preferred in Adelaide. I don't think the Greens will make much impact this election. And finally, in Mayo, I think the Liberals will get back in front on that notional two-party preferred, but it'll be an easy retain on a slightly reduced margin for Rebecca Sharkey. Thanks again for listening, everybody. Keep your eyes out for new videos. Subscribe, like, leave your comments below, and I shall speak with you again soon.